There is no such thing as a perfect game. There's countless games out there that get super close to hitting that mark. There will always be something to complain about in a game, no matter how incredibly made you think the game is. You might be thinking that your favourite game is perfect, but I'm sure if you really sat down and tried to think about it, there would be something that you disliked about it. And just to prove this point, I took 5 of my favourite games of all time and made a list of things that I don't like about every single one of them. Because there's no such thing as a perfect game. Some games get really close. In fact, some games get so close that I omit them from the video because they're too hard to think of criticisms for, but every game has its flaws. So let's get started on the journey to nitpick apart 5 of my favourite games ever made. I have no idea which game to start with, so Team Fortress 2! No, relax. So for me, Team Fortress 2 is going to be split into 2 separate categories. The normal base game of TF2, where you shoot at the enemy gamers, and TF2 Jump maps, where you settle down a little bit and just rocket jump and sticky jump around for a bit of a laugh. TF2 is by far my most played game of all time, and the majority of this time has been spent in jump maps, so they're basically 2 separate games for me. But before we get to jumping, I want to talk about the base game, because TF2's base game is absolutely incredible. It's the reason I got into the game in the first place, and it is immaculately designed. But despite how well made it is, the game is suffering right now under the thumb of its bot overlords. An uncaring developer has left this 14-year-old game completely out in the open for cheaters and botters to abuse as much as they want. Doesn't matter how well made a game is, if the game has an enormous cheating problem that is barely getting addressed by the developers, the game will stop being fun really fast. Outside of community servers and community organised tournaments, the game's not that much fun to play in its current state. Which is why a lot of the player base has flocked to these community-made servers, or has just stopped playing entirely. The game they know and love has been taken over by a bunch of bored nerds who decided that ruining everyone else's fun was a valuable use of their time, energy, and even money. But the bot crisis, in my opinion, is low-hanging fruit. It's really easy to criticise TF2 for having a cheater problem. What's much harder to do is to criticise TF2 based on its design decisions. So that's exactly what I'm going to try and do. The Spy. Really cool, right? Cool sneaky Frenchman. He's the worst class in the entire game. His entire role in the game is to be an assassin. He's a pick class. His job is to go in and kill a single high priority target. But do you know who else has that exact same job? The Sniper. G'day. Except the Sniper can do it from all the way over here in Fucksville, where the Spy has to spend 4.5 years sneaking around behind enemies just to get his 1 kill. And even when he does get that 1 kill, he probably dies immediately afterwards anyway. The Spy is completely outclassed in every way by the Sniper, because the Sniper fulfills the exact same role, but from a safer distance. Spy even has a weapon specifically designed to attack the engineer's buildings, but the Sapper is much less effective than a sniper just headshotting the engineer and leaving all of his buildings defenseless. But even the Sniper has its troubles. TF2 is designed around generalists and specialists. The specialist classes are classes that do one job particularly well. These guys are super good at being defensive. These guys are single target pick classes, but the generalists are designed to be more generally applicable. They can go from attacking to defending in an instant, and they don't lose any general effectiveness while they do it. They have good mobility, as well as higher damage, and never find themselves being useless because of the circumstances that they find themselves in. But that means that in a competitive scenario, these classes are super powerful, and these classes rarely ever see play. This is one of the many reasons that TF2 struggled to take off as an esport. More than half of the roster never sees play, and the only way to allow them into the competitive scene would be to allow them to use their super overpowered weapon unlocks to break the game with. Yeah, because most weapon unlocks are banned by the competitive rule set that players use today. But without these borderline broken unlocks, the generalists will always reign supreme. Their high damage and high mobility makes them greatly outshadow the other classes almost every time, other than a few specific last point defense scenarios. Oh, and speaking of high mobility, It's time to talk about the joys of being a jump main. TF2 Jump has the unique problem of not actually being a standalone game. It's a community-created game mode in a 14-year-old game that is managed by a small group of passionate players who want to keep the scene alive. Momentum Mod will release one day, and that will be a standalone jump game. But until then, we're a part of a community-made server system, not a standalone game. And the community certainly is still alive and kicking, but because it's not overseen by a game developer, but instead by a small group of passionate admins, this means that a lot of decisions get made by the final say-so of an admin who isn't monetarily affected by the community's pleasure or displeasure in their decisions. The servers that most jump mains play on are called the Tempest servers. This is where all the most competitive jumpers play, and compete against each other's speedrun times, and to try and get as high on the leaderboard as they possibly can. And there are a lot of maps to speedrun on Tempest. There's over 650 of them. But some of the maps that are in this big map pool are, interesting, to say the least. The most competitive jump server in the entire game has maps that are very low effort, very poorly made, very old, and sometimes literally made as a funny joke. The old maps I can give a pass on, because the people that made them didn't really know what they were doing. No one knew what made a good jump map, so they were added way back when in the prehistoric times. Those get a pass. But when a map that feels like it hasn't been playtested for a single second gets added to Tempest in 2021, the year of our Lord, it gets under my skin quite a lot. There are also some maps that aren't objectively bad, they're just so different and so out of the box compared to every other map that quite a few people, including myself, don't really enjoy playing them. They're perfect for what they are, it's just that what they are is not something that I really appreciate. So you might be wondering, if this is the case, how do they end up getting added to the servers anyway? Well, it's because of what we mentioned earlier. It's a community-developed game mode. I didn't want this part to just entirely be conjecture and full of anecdotal evidence, so I posted a poll onto the Tempest Discord server, and after about 2 or 3 hours, the results looked like this. This middle ground option won out by a landslide with 70% of the votes, which to me shows that people would appreciate some quality control on what gets added to Tempest. Because most people would agree that the quality of the maps varies wildly. Some extremely old maps are still knocking around being terrible, because anyone can make a map, and you best believe that anyone will make a map. As far as we can tell, the philosophy on Tempest at the moment is this option here, that the more content to speedrun, the better. I personally disagree with that logic, and clearly so do a decent number of other people. Or at least, a decent number of these 56 people. I couldn't get anyone else to answer it, but anyway. There's clearly a difference in perspective here between me and the admins, and neither of us are objectively wrong or anything, it's just an opinion. But since it's my list about how no game is made perfect, then I'm gonna slap my opinion right on there. I'm of course not trying to throw shade at the Tempest admins here, I'm sure they have a justification for their point of view that's just as well thought out as mine, if not more well thought out. But I've certainly found that the low quality maps that get added to Tempest frustrate me quite a lot. But hey, at least I don't have to play them more than once, right? So what we got next? Oh cool, Terraria, I love that game. One of the most exciting parts of Terraria for me is the boss fights. There's so much anticipation associated with them. You spend such a long time prepping for the boss that you're about to fight, making sure you get enough gear to successfully fight them, and the fights become super intense because of it. Well, super intense, unless you do this. Certain bosses in Terraria are very, very easy to cheese, and I don't actually have to fight the boss, because the way the boss functions allows me to just sit in a box and avoid almost all damage. Now, there are more glitchy ways to cheese bosses, like with an old target dummy glitch, but I'm not really going to count those, because they're glitches and exploits more than they are game mechanics. But this is just a result of the way the boss functions. He's a worm who needs to gain momentum underground, so I can just sit high up in a box. Or how most of the cultists' attacks are blocked by a small roof between me and the boss. Plantera can't figure out teleporters, stuff like that. You obviously don't have to cheese the bosses, but just knowing that an easier way to fight them exists makes fighting them legit feel a little bit silly. My biggest criticism of this game is the way that the progression is balanced. Certain items can be crafted fairly early on in your progression, but will be powerful enough to last you a very long time into the game. The most infamous example of this is the Daedalus Stormbow. It can be acquired at the very start of hard mode, right after the Wall of Flesh, but could easily be used to defeat pretty much every single boss before the Moonlord. This weapon was nerfed, but even after that nerf, it is still extremely powerful considering how easy it is to acquire. Terraria is rife with this sort of thing, and not all of it is actually a fixable problem. One of Terraria's biggest strengths is that its progression is not that strict. You can skip certain aspects of the progression at your leisure if you feel like it. This is great because it means that if you don't feel like going through the long grind of getting titanium armor, for example, you just don't have to do that. Just settle for Palladium or Cobalt and fight the boss anyway. The game doesn't force you down a certain path very hard, which is really good. But because of this, certain items will be underutilized because of how easy they are to skip, or some items will be overutilized because of how powerful they are, aiding in your ability to skip certain weapons and armor sets. A lot of Terraria's balance issues can and have been fixed, but some of it is just the natural result of the way the game functions. But now, let's go spin the wheel again. Risk of Rain 2. Jesus, what a banger. Anyway, Risk of Rain 2, as incredible as it is, has yet another balance flaw. The characters in the roster vary wildly in their consistency, due to their overall power level with and without items. The Captain and the Bandit are arguably the two best characters in the game. Their damage output is insane, both with and without items, and they have great utility. They're both fairly immobile, but more experienced players will realise that having no mobility in your kit doesn't really matter if your damage is really high. In the early game, your damage output means you don't need the mobility, and by the time you've got a bunch of items, you're already running at the speed of sound anyway. All you have to do is chug 17 energy drinks and suddenly the Captain's not that slow anymore. Their early game damage allows them to cruise to the point where they've already gathered enough items to become completely unstoppable. Let's then compare this to the worst character in the entire game, hands down, in my opinion. The Mercenary. The Mercenary's damage output is just about lower than every other character in the game at any point during the game. Mercenary is also very difficult to play, meaning that Mercenary has to try really hard just to maintain a half-decent damage output, whereas other characters just gotta press their 4 buttons randomly to kill stuff. Mercenary doesn't synergize very well with on-hit items, which are generally the best items in the game for getting high damage output, but he also struggles to use a lot of the other items too, since he's an entirely melee-based character who relies very heavily on his third hit of his left-click attack for the bulk of his damage. These two characters coexist in the same game, so this guy suffers terribly trying to achieve anything close to the success of the other characters, and this guy just waltzes up onto Mithrix and shotguns him in the face. This, honestly, is my only real gripe with Risk of Rain 2. Come to think of it, it might be the game that I have the least negative things to say about. You know, maybe I could complain that not every item is very useful, but that's the whole point. If every item was super good, then the excitement of getting a good item out of a chest would be completely gone, and the difference between a good run and a bad run would be next to invisible. Those exciting synergies between items would also fade away instantly if every item was just as good as everything else. The story's cool, but it's also not intrusive onto the gameplay. Character design is great, even if some of the characters are a bit on the weaker side. Dying instantaneously 90 minutes into a run can be frustrating for some people, but it comes with the territory when you play a game that has infinite scaling difficulty. This game is incredible. Easily the best roguelike ever made, and it's still going to get more content updates in the future. Wait a minute, this video was meant to be negative, wasn't it? On to the next game, spin the wheel! Now this game right here is actually pretty hard to criticise, because a lot of the things I think are really cool about the game are simultaneously things that I think would turn away most players. For anyone out of the loop, Rain World is a 2D survival game, where you have to find food and find shelter before the rain comes to kill you. The whole premise of the game is that you're fairly weak and defenseless. The game is crushingly difficult and doesn't really tell you anything about anything. It barely even tells you the controls of the game. Yet that is precisely what I think makes the game so exciting. The game nudges you in the right direction constantly, but is subtle enough to make it an actual challenge to discover things on your own. I guess my biggest criticism would be that Rain World takes this premise to the absolute extreme. If you go through a series of unfortunate events, you can legitimately be stranded at a certain shelter on the map with practically no way to recover your run. If you don't have a high enough amount of karma to pass through this gate to get to where you need to go, whilst also being in a spot that's extremely hard to survive in, you'll probably just be stranded there forever. In fact, in my run of Rain World, I got stuck right outside the farm arrays so badly that I just started the game from the beginning again. This game also has harder alternate paths through the game that can be accessed if you know where to find them. The whole point of these is that they're far away enough that a new player isn't likely to find them, but a new player could realistically walk past the place they're supposed to go and stumble upon it anyway. If this did happen to a new player, and they didn't go to the slightly more intended gate, they will have a very, very hard time progressing. These harder routes expect you to have already experienced the game, and to have gone through this route on purpose. If that's not you, you're pretty screwed. The game can sometimes be much too punishing for a lot of people to put up with. But again, that's sort of the entire point. That's what the game was made to be. So it sort of achieved its goal perfectly, in a way, even though it's also a criticism. My criticism, in reality, is that the game doesn't appeal to a very wide audience, but instead to a very, very particular niche that wants a game just like it. But that isn't unintentional. That's exactly what the game went for. Most of the time, it's a decent challenge to figure out how to evade an enemy, or where to go next, but sometimes it's completely ridiculous. Like the giant deers in the farm arrays, the way to progress is to use these little spore sack things to bait down a reindeer, and then to ride it across the tall grass to get to the next place. But knowing that's what to do, without googling it, is pretty ridiculous. The spore sacks spawn nowhere near the reindeer, and also have a secondary use of killing the centipedes. So if you think that that's its only use, you're just wandering around the farm arrays completely lost. I guess what I'm trying to say is that this game isn't for everyone. If you hate the sound of what I just described, then this game won't be for you. However, if you're up for that sort of grueling challenge, where the game forces you to figure it out all on your own, then Rain World is definitely the game for you. Now last, and definitely least, we have League of Legends. Saying League of Legends is one of my favourite games is honestly really hard to do, because I've really fallen out of love with the game. I think it's an incredible game, but the community's behaviour, as well as the hideously punishing gameplay loop, made me quit the game for good a while back now. But despite those things that mired my experiences, it's still one of my favourite games, even if it feels weird to say that, even if I will likely never play the game again. And since it's on the list, I'm going to pick it apart for a few minutes. But first I'll say that I'm going to leave out two very low-hanging fruit criticisms, just because it's a bit boring. The balance of League of Legends can sometimes leave a lot to be desired. But that's the case for every multiplayer game ever made at some point in its history. I'll also try to ignore the hideous toxicity that the game features, because that isn't really a criticism of the game itself. But of course, it's still annoying, and it certainly puts a pretty big dampener on the game when you get called a racial slur once every 3 games. But moving on to the real criticisms, the way that the gold mechanics work is extremely punishing, and can make a game feel completely hopeless from very early on. Dying early on can feel like the game is completely over, and that the enemy team has a lead that you couldn't possibly recover from. And sometimes that is literally true. The game is completely over 2 minutes into the game, which is horrible, since you're likely going to have to be stuck in that game for the next 30 to 40 minutes. Something that League suffers from, that a lot of games also suffer from, is that newer characters have super overloaded kits compared to older characters. This would have been an entire champion in 2015, but because he was released in 2021, that's just his W. Rinse and repeat for every new champion, and that's just sort of how the game feels. The monetization of League of Legends is actually pretty good, especially when you consider how predatory some games are with their monetization tactics. League lets you just straight up buy whatever skin you want, instead of having to buy a chance to get a cool hat. but it still has its flaws. If you're a new player in 2021, it would take you an extraordinary amount of time to unlock every champion in the game without spending money. Unlocking one champion in particular that you want to play doesn't take too long, which is great. But there's over 150 of the bastards now, so unlocking every single one is an enormous task that only exists to try and make you open your wallet. I think the core gameplay loop of League of Legends is very, very fun, and its character design is also spectacular. Mostly. But this gets bogged down a little by small nitpicks that overall drag the game down a bit. But these criticisms are nothing compared to how awful the toxicity and culture surrounding the game has become. I would still be playing the game now if it didn't literally make me sad to do so, because the game itself is a good one, but it's a game that's drenched in toxicity, and that toxicity is celebrated by the community at large. There is no such thing as a perfect game, and if I can pick apart my favourite games like this, then so can you. I would love to hear criticisms of your favourite games in the comments, because this isn't usually something people sit down and do, so I'd love to hear the hot takes. This little exercise can be a lot of fun, so long as you remember to love the games in spite of their flaws anyway. Thanks for watching.